The wind that swept down from the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains carried more than just the scent of pine and cold stone. It carried a sound, a lament that had become as regular as the setting sun. Every night, just as the last sliver of crimson bled away behind the western ridge, the first scream would tear through the valley. It was a sound not of this earth, a high, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated terror that raised the hair on the back of the neck and set the coyotes to a nervous, answering chorus. Elias Thorne heard it, as he had for 43 consecutive nights, standing on the warped wooden porch of his ranch house, a steaming mug of coffee forgotten in his gnarled hand. He was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains, his face a roadmap of hard years and solitude, but this sound was sanding away at his resolve. It wasn't the scream of a mountain lion, nor the cry of a wounded elk. This was something else, something that held a chilling, almost intelligent anguish. The first scream always came at twilight. The second an hour later as true dark embraced the land. The third would rip through the silence around midnight. And the fourth in the bleak, hollow hours just before the dawn. But it was the fifth scream, the one that came just as the sky began to soften from black to a deep, bruised gray. That was the worst. It was different. It was not just a scream of fear, but one of profound, soul-shattering loss, a sound that seemed to suck the very hope from the world. Elias would listen, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, his gaze fixed on the dark, brooding line of the forest where the sound originated. The other ranchers in the distant spreads had packed up and left weeks ago, muttering about curses and angry spirits. The nearest town, a 2-day ride away, had labeled the area haunted. But Elias Thorne had poured his life, his sweat, and the memory of his late wife into this land. He would not be run off by a noise. Yet it was more than a noise. It began to affect the very fabric of his reality. His cattle grew thin and spooked, their eyes wide and white-rimmed. The chickens ceased to lay. A pervasive sense of dread clung to the ranch like a foul mist. On the 44th night, something changed. As the third scream faded, Elias, driven by a mixture of fury and a desperate need for answers, saddled his old buckskin mare and rode to the edge of the tree line. He would not enter, not yet, but he would meet this terror halfway. He sat there in the cold moonlight, his Winchester rifle across his saddle, and waited. When the fourth scream came, it was so close, it felt like it was right behind him, vibrating in his own chest. The mare reared, snorting in panic, and then, in the silence that followed, he saw it. A flicker of movement deep within the forest, not an animal, but a pale, fleeting shape that vanished between the towering pines. It was in that moment that Elias Thorne, a man of logic and soil, was forced to accept the unacceptable. He was not dealing with a beast, but with a presence. And the fifth scream, when it came, was a whisper on the wind that seemed to speak his name. He rode back to his empty house, a cold certainty settling in his gut. This could not continue. He would have to go into that forest. He would have to find the source. The unthinkable was becoming the only path left. Dawn of the 45th day found Elias not on his porch, but in the deep, silent vault of his root cellar, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. He ignored the jars of preserves and the sacks of grain, moving instead to a heavy, iron-bound chest tucked beneath the stairs. The key, unused for a decade, felt cold in his hand. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay the legacy he had tried to bury, a collection of items that spoke of a world beyond cattle and crops. There was a tarnished silver medallion, a pouch of dried, bitter herbs, and a journal, its pages filled with the elegant script of his grandmother, a woman the townsfolk had whispered was a wise woman when they were being polite. She had come from the old country, from the misty highlands, where the line between this world and the next was said to be thin. Elias had rejected her ways, embracing the tangible world of the American frontier. But now the frontier itself had revealed a darker, older truth. He spent the day in a feverish study, the journal open on his rough-hewn table. The screams his grandmother's writing suggested were not of a ghost in the traditional sense, but of a Kauranach, a sorrow spirit. It was an entity born of a trauma so violent, so unjust, that its echo could not fade. It was bound to a place, replaying its final moments of terror, and its incessant grief was a poison that bled the life from the land around it. It could not be shot, nor could it be reasoned with. The only way to silence it was to perform a rite of unbinding, a ritual that would absorb its pain and allow it to finally dissipate. The unthinkable was not an act of violence, but an act of profound empathy. He would have to listen, truly listen to each scream, and at the moment of the fifth, he would have to offer it a vessel for its sorrow, a vessel of his own blood and memory. As twilight fell, Elias walked into the forest. He carried no rifle, only a small knife, the silver medallion, and the pouch of herbs. He found the clearing where the pale shape had vanished, a place that felt unnaturally cold and silent. He built a small circle of stones, and as the first scream erupted, he did not flinch. He let it wash over him, feeling its raw, primal fear. He lit the herbs, and a sharp, cleansing smoke curled into the air. The second and third screams came, and with each, Elias focused, pouring his own will into the circle, creating a container for the entity's agony. The forest around him seemed to warp, the trees leaning in as if watching. When the fourth scream tore through the night, the pale form appeared before him, the shimmering, fractured image of a young woman in a tattered pioneer dress, her face a mask of endless horror. He met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting not fear but a deep, weary sorrow. He thought of his own loss, of the wife he had buried, and he opened that old wound, using his own grief as a bridge to hers. As the sky began to lighten, the fifth scream built, a pressure in the air that threatened to shatter his very bones. This was the moment. Instead of resisting, he stepped forward into the heart of the apparition. The cold was absolute, a pain that froze the soul. He felt her story flood into him, the betrayal, the attack, the lonely death in this clearing a century ago. It was a torrent of anguish that sought to drown him. With a final monumental effort, he pressed the silver medallion to his own chest, over his heart, and whispered the words of the rite. "I take your pain. I bear your witness. Now be at peace." There was no grand explosion, only a sudden, profound silence. The pale form softened, the terror in its eyes melting into something like gratitude. It dissolved into 1,000 motes of light that drifted upwards, fading into the emerging dawn. Elias collapsed to his knees, exhausted. The weight of a century's sorrow, a leaden cloak upon his soul. But as the sun rose, its light felt warm again. The birds began to sing. The curse was broken. He had done the unthinkable. He had not fought the monster, but had healed it. The valley was safe, but Elias Thorne was forever changed, the keeper of a story too terrible to ever tell. He walked back to his ranch, a solitary figure in the morning light. The silence now a welcome companion. If you were captivated by the story of Elias Thorne and the sorrow spirit, if you crave tales where the true frontier horror lies not in the barrel of a gun, but in the shadows of the human heart and the forgotten legends of the land, then you cannot afford to miss what comes next. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing the deepest, most chilling narratives of the American West. Subscribe now and ring the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting in the silence, and it demands to be heard.